I have been invited to one of my favourite local schools tomorrow lunchtime to give their lunchtime lecture, Southend High School for boys, who also have girls in their sixth form, I'm pleased to say. And I thought I'd try it out on here for just the length of time because it's quite strict. You don't want to interrupt with people's lunches, and they've asked me to speak for 20 minutes. So I'll give it a run through here and then I'll know how much time to knock off. The talk is on inflation. It's about the causes, the consequences, the cures of the current inflation. So hopefully you'll enjoy my take on this. I will have to warn the students, of course, that my views on this are quite different from other economists in the mainstream. We all agree on microeconomics, but we don't agree on macroeconomics. So this is my take on inflation, and of course it's the take that I consider to be the correct interpretation. Now, although it's causes, consequences and cures, I'm going to start by just mentioning the consequences, because as economists we don't disagree about the consequences of inflation. The disagreement is about the causes and the cures. Unfortunately, with me talking, you won't see the slides that the students will see, but I'll hopefully describe them to you in a way that will make sense. So I shall have to point out to the students initially that the consequences of inflation are the creation of winners and losers. If there were no winners, we wouldn't have any inflation. It's because people benefit from inflation that we have it. And if we look through the losers, we can then balance out whether we think inflation is good for the economy or bad for the economy. Inflation redistributes people's income, and it unfortunately tends to redistribute income in favour of the stronger and well-organised groups in society at the expense of the weak and disorganised groups in society. It redistributes wealth in favour of those who own real assets, that's, shall we say, gold or paintings or houses, at the expense of those who have cash contracts, usually savings, pensions, etc. It makes many debtors better off at the expense of creditors, the savers. They become worse off. It damages the currency, it distorts the economy. It does actually cause unemployment, which is something that may need to be explained to some economists, and it causes stagflation, that mix of inflation and unemployment. It creates conflicts, strikes. We've all seen the strikes building up at the moment, and I suppose I should mention that I'm talking about this in November 2022, just in case you're listening to this in 10 years' time and wonder what on earth I'm talking about in terms of what is current then. So this is now 2022 November, and we have created a lot of strikes, mistrust, social unrest. And the bottom line of the consequences of inflation is that it is an unconstitutional tax on money. Now, what that means is government never voted for this tax. It just happens. Now, I shall ask the students two questions at the start, which I will expect them to work out the answer by the end, although I will give it to them as well. And I want to know who benefits most from inflation and who causes inflation. Now, unfortunately, one of the problems about this is that there are three words in use around this issue, whereas there should actually be four. The three words are reflation, deflation, and inflation. Now, reflation is the opposite of deflation. Reflating an economy means expanding aggregate monetary demand, and deflation means contracting aggregate monetary demand. And reflation, if you expand aggregate monetary demand, that may not cause inflation. It could all be absorbed by a growth in output. You then have the word inflation, which is quite clearly a rise in the average level of prices. You could, however, have a period of deflation, which is a contraction in aggregate monetary demand, at the same time as you observe inflation. Keynesians will explain, yes, that's cost push inflation. They're wrong, but I'll explain that in a minute. What you would really like is 4 words so that there's no confusion that you could have inflation, which is the opposite of deflation, at the same time as you have the two things, occurring together. Let's make that clear. This is a PhD for someone in philology, I think, but we really do need to have reflation and deflation being the opposite of each other, while we need inflation and another word. I'll suggest dinflation. I have no idea. Someone will come out with a better word than that, I'm sure. Where inflation is a rise in the average level of prices, dinflation a fall in the average level of prices, reflation expansion in aggregate monetary demand, deflation a contraction in aggregate monetary demand. We haven't got that, however, so most people understand deflation as the opposite of inflation, a fall in the average level of prices, and that is the way that we will deal with that today. Now, I will ask the students what they think is the main cause of the current inflation. Is it the war in Ukraine? Is it energy prices? Is it food prices? Is it all of the above? And no doubt we'll have lots of takers for those things, as they're generally described as causes by the mainstream economists and mainstream media. I'll also follow that up with a question: who thinks the current inflation was caused by the Bank of England? And hopefully by the end of the talk we'll have an answer to all of that. The current rate of inflation, if you measure it on CPI, the Consumer Price Index, it's 11.1%. If you measure it through the Retail Price Index, it's 14.2%. There's a website, Trueflation, which includes things that probably matter more to people, like their mortgages and interest rates, and therefore are significant when they consider their incomes and what's happening to them. And they say the current rate of inflation is 18.13%. I'm just going to concentrate very quickly on the difference between CPI and RPI, because we're looking at a 3.1% difference between those two numbers, and the better of those two numbers is RPI. CPI undervalues inflation, and I'll go through a simple example to explain that to the students, and you'll have to follow me very carefully because you're not going to see the slide. RPI, Retail Price Index, is an arithmetic average, whereas CPI is a geometric average. Now let me explain the difference. If there were two products and they were both priced at 4, then the average of those arithmetically would be 4 plus 4 equals 8. 8 divided by 2 equals 4. Nice and easy. The geometric average would be 4 times 4 is 16, and the square root of 16 is 4. So they are both the same thing. However, suppose one of those prices doubled, went up from 4 to 8, and the other halved, went down from 4 to 2. We now have two prices in front of us, 8 and 2. Arithmetically, 8 plus 2 equals 10. 10 divided by 2 equals 5. That's 4 has risen to 5, an average 25% increase in inflation. Geometrically, it's 8 times 2 equals 16. Square root of 16 equals 4. Now we have no inflation at all if you measure it geometrically. That's why when you've got more items in the basket, it's not quite as crude, that gap, although we're talking about 3.1% gap at the moment. And you can see that the arithmetic average better explains inflation and changes in the value of money, because before I had to spend £8 to buy these two items. Now I've got to spend £10 to buy these two items. So it's not no change in the value of money to me, or no inflation to me. So you are misled by the CPI measure of inflation. Now let's get it clear. I've said it once, but let's say it again. The definition of inflation is a rise in the average level of prices. Economists often say it's a rise in the general level of prices because they want to take a little bit of the focus away from the average. They'd rather sort of just think about prices in general rather than averages. But they do mean average, and I'm going to concentrate on average because average is exactly what tells us the cause. So definition, we're going to follow this through. It's a rise in the average level of prices. Now, implicit in that definition of inflation is that it's more units of money which has been spent on the same number of transactions. That's important. It's more units of money. You can't measure it any other way than it's been more units of money spent on the same number of transactions. It's actually not possible to have inflation in a barter economy. If people were just trading one product for another, you could never have inflation, because if one product goes up, the other automatically goes down by the same amount. The average would never change. The average can only change when you have a third party in there, namely money. So money is made up of two elements. It's a stock and it's a flow. Now, we said more units of money in the same number of transactions is what inflation is. Now, those more units of money can come from two things. They can come from an increase in the stock of money, or it could be the same amount of money, the same stock of money, moving around the economy more quickly. So what we're really concerned about is monetary demand. And monetary demand has two components to it. It's M, the stock, and it's V, the velocity of circulation of that stock, the speed that it goes round. And we are with one side of the quantity theory of money there, something that I will encourage you all to think about, because it does explain this quite clearly and quite easily. M times V is the monetary side of the equation, where P times T, the average price level times the number of transactions, is the real side of the equation. It's the goods and services that you trade. So the quantity theory of money, MV equals PT, is very important in understanding what is going on. Now, if you read the textbooks for economics give you two causes of inflation: demand pull or cost push. Demand pull is where there is excessive demand at the current level of output. Cost push is when something pushes up the prices of that output. And one of them, unfortunately, doesn't exist. Cost push is a myth. It can't exist, because demand pull explains things. If you actually look in the Oxford English Dictionary, it says inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And that's exactly what demand pull is: too much money chasing too few goods. If you have higher commodity prices, food prices, energy prices, even supply chain problems, then they do push up costs, but they don't raise the average level of prices if there's no more units of money available to purchase those products. It's the more units of money that determine whether you have got any inflation or not. Now, the managers, therefore, of money and monetary demand in the economy must also be those who cause all the inflations. So who manages money, who manages monetary demand in the economy? It's the central bank. So the central bank must be the cause of all of the inflation that you see in an economy, in any country of the world. It's the central bank. Now, how does the central bank deceive you into thinking that it's not them that causes the inflation? There are theories, of course, to support them. Keynesian theories, modern monetary theorists, the Treasury, the Bank of England, they all help a deception which is caused by the fact that there is a time lag between monetary actions now and how they show up as mistakes in the future. It's 1 or 2 years. And even worse than that, it doesn't mean that if the government and the Bank of England, the Treasury, are all complicit in increasing the money supply, it actually has beneficial effects now. It's only in a year or two's time that you see those effects having the very opposite impact on the economy. So the initial effect of printing money is government can enrich people, it can employ people, it can support all manner of good causes, it can woo the voter. However, when inflation comes, that distorts the markets, damages market signals, increases waste, is part of stagflation, and it actually destroys economic growth. So that comes a little bit later. In fact, I continually argue with the Bank of England over this, and we do at the university have the occasional open lecture. I say open, it's open to the students. Unfortunately, it's not open to everyone else because they take place under Chatham House rules, which means it can't be reported. And I have talked to two members of the Monetary Policy Committee, and I've accused them of deceiving people because their inflation report says inflation is this number and these prices have gone up the most. And they both said to me, no, we don't say that. Read it carefully. What we say is the rate of inflation is this, and these prices are the ones that have gone up the most. We don't say they cause the inflation, we're just pointing out which prices have gone up the most. And you, the media, interpret that as being causal. In other words, these rises in energy prices, food prices have caused the inflation. They haven't, and most of the Bank of England understand that they caused the inflation, but they certainly don't want you to know that they did. So why do we have such a high rate of inflation now? It's nothing to do with what you are told is causing inflation now. It's all to do with the pandemic. During the pandemic, promises were made by government to spend on research, furlough, track and trace, pop-up hospitals, frontline services, and many other things. There was no more tax coming in, so how do you finance it? You have to finance it through borrowing. Borrowing means you can sell debt to real people, which is actually non-inflationary. Or you can let the central bank print money to the value of unsold debt and buy back debt that's currently in circulation, which is exactly what the Bank of England did. So the Bank of England, through a QE programme, printed the money then that financed excessive government spending. Now, the Bank of England won't admit that. In fact, if you go and visit the Bank of England, you'll find a little pink book there which tells you nothing about QE causing money to be printed or new money to be created, but I assure you that that is the case. So what happened was you had an initial increase in money stock, and people thought, this is good, I can stay at home, I haven't got to go to work now, and we are going to get the same or a very similar income. So initially, the stock of money increased considerably, but the speed it went round didn't, because you were locked down. You couldn't get out and spend that money, or it was a lot harder to get out and spend that money. So as soon as lockdown finishes and people get back into spending habits, the increased stock, the acceleration in the flow, M times V, increases monetary demand much more rapidly than output, and the result of that is that prices start to rise. Inflation is that headache after the money rush. And the money rush made us all feel better off in 2020, and unfortunately it's beginning to make us feel worse off now in 2022 and 2023. So I was quite able to explain to people in 2020, inflation is coming. Not many people believed me. In fact, the last time I gave a talk at Southend High School, it was on money, and I pointed out to you then that inflation around 5% will soon be in double digits. And of course, we now have that situation. So, what's the cure for inflation? The cure for inflation is quite easy, because I've concluded there's only one cause of inflation. So logically, there's only one cure. Monetary demand must be managed by the central bank to grow at just a few percentage points faster than the expected growth in output. In other words, if output is expected to grow at 3%, then if monetary demand grows at 5%, the inflation target of 2% will be achieved. It's as simple as that. Under no circumstances should government try to manage prices or impose restrictions on costs. Both costs and prices should just be left to market forces. You control the average level of prices by managing monetary demand more efficiently than you have done in the past. So, conclusions. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Milton Friedman said it a long time ago, and it stands today as being correct. Those responsible for causing inflation are those central banks that manage monetary demand. Cost push inflation is a myth. Rising costs don't increase the number of monetary units in the economy. And if we look at broad money aggregates now and over the last year, and remember that time lag of a year to 2 years, we're going to begin to see inflation falling as we go into 2023. It's probably peaking about now, although not all economists agree. I'll tell you that that's going to happen, and what is going to occur is, I suppose, a fifth word here, disinflation is on the way. That's slowing in the rate of increase of inflation, so separate from the the 3 words that we talked about earlier. And so we come to the answer, who benefits most from inflation? Well, it is debtors who benefit most from inflation. Who's the biggest debtor in the economy? The biggest debtor in the economy is the government. Who causes inflation? Well, through their central bank, it's the government. Both answers are the government cause the inflation and they benefit most from that inflation. I hope you've enjoyed that quick illustration of inflation as it is at present, and that it makes sense to you. But again, I warn you, lots of other people will disagree with me, but you must just listen very carefully to what I say, listen to what they say, and make up your mind about whether or not we want to have a much stricter discipline over our central bank and the way they manage monetary policy. Thank you.